All right, everyone. Welcome to another episode of The Big Questions with Big John. I'm your host, Big John, and today we have a very special guest. He is a noted anarcho-capitalist. I was going to say anarcho-libertarian, but I don't want to insult anybody, so I'll just say anarcho-capitalist. Let me give you a little bit of his bio. Walter Block is a renowned American economist and anarcho-capitalist theorist. He was a student of Murray Rothbard, and I believe actually sat down with Ayn Rand a couple of times. He's considered one of the prominent modern disciples of Rothbardian thought. Also, he's made important contributions to fields like ethics, environmental economics, the economics of discrimination, which is an interesting topic. Also, Professor Block has had a prolific academic career. He's authored several books, several articles. He's made several lectures, but perhaps his most prominent book is Defending the Undefendable, which people always seem to refer to when it comes to Professor Block. Ladies and gentlemen, Walter Block. Walter, how are you today?
Good. Thanks for the kind introduction. Good to be with you.
Oh, thank you so much, sir. And can I say right off the bat that you are looking incredibly fit, incredibly spry. Can we tell the audience how old you are?
Almost 83.
Almost 83. Goodness gracious, God bless you. You look fine. You still speak like with a passion, and I'm just about touching 60, and I'm sure I don't look anywhere near as healthy and spry as you do, sir. So congratulations on that. Okay, let's start out just with the very obvious. You are considered one of the more prominent anarcho-capitalist thinkers today. For our audience that may not be as familiar with anarcho-capitalism, give us a little bit of an overview of the philosophy of anarcho-capitalism, especially, say, comparing it to your run-of-the-mill, if there's such a thing, libertarian philosophy.
Okay, well, that's a very good question, and I'm delighted to start off in that way. The way I see matters, and the joke is if you get 10 libertarians and you ask them a question, you'll get 15 answers.
Right.
Not everyone would agree with me, but I see anarcho-capitalism as one of the aspects of libertarianism. So before getting into anarcho-capitalism, let me just say what libertarianism is.
Fair enough, sir.
So what libertarianism is predicated on really three foundational principles. One of them is the non-aggression principle. Don't initiate violence against anyone. And if you do, you're going to jail, or we're going to punish you, or you're a criminal. Now, that doesn't mean that we're pacifists. So you and I can have a boxing match, and I can punch you and you can punch me, but we've agreed to be punched and to punch. So that doesn't count as the initiation of violence, even though if you're in the ring with Mike Tyson, you might do it differently. But if you're there, you agree to be there. So that's the first principle. And based on that, what laws would be justified? Because libertarianism is really a theory of what is just law. And the laws that would be justified would be anti-murder, rape, theft, arson, kidnapping, things like that.
Yes,
now,
sir.
I admire the headphones you're wearing. Suppose I come over and I grab those headphones. Am I a thief? Well, it all depends upon who is the rightful owner of those headphones. If you stole them from me yesterday, I'm just repossessing them. You're the bad guy. I'm the good guy.
Correct.
On the other hand, I've never seen them before. They're yours. And if I grab them, I'm the bad guy. So we have to have a theory of private property rights in order to make the non-aggression principle work. Because otherwise, we can't tell if I'm a criminal or not if I grab your shoes or your car or
right. We can't define the aggressor in that case.
Precisely.
Yeah.
So how do we come up with proper ownership? Homesteading. John Locke and Murray Rothbard said the way you get to own land is by mixing your labor with it. You clear a tree, you put some corn in there, and now you own that land. And I domesticate a cow, and I own the cow. And another legitimate way of title transfer would be anything legitimate. For example, barter. I own the milk, but I trade you for some corn, and now I own the corn, even though I didn't produce it, but I can trace it back to legitimate ownership, homesteading, and then legitimate title transfer, of which barter would be one, but gift giving, buying, selling, renting, whatever would be legitimate. And
Right. And I'm sorry, sir, but just to Walter, just to distinguish this from anyone who may have the idea, well, Walter mentioned working the land, domesticating a cow, breaking a horse, something like that. I could just see someone snarky saying, well, isn't that just might makes right? Wouldn't the strongest in those situations then have the right to claim property, perhaps even over fellow humans?
well, it's not the strongest, it's the first guy there. And you're big and strong. You're Big John. I'm Little Walter. But I got to the cow first, and I own the cow. Now, you're a bigger guy than me, let's say, and you steal my cow. Well, the libertarian would say, well, then you're a criminal and you go to jail for doing that. So,
Right.
what libertarianism is a theory of what is just law.
Mm,
And little guys like me can be the first to get the cow, or not. You were the first one to get that corn patch, and
right.
if I start stealing your corn, I'm equally guilty. So size and strength don't really matter. It's righteousness that matters.
Correct. Correct.
Okay, and the third principle, if I could put it that way, would be the free association. No one should be compelled to associate with anyone else against his will. Which means secession is justified. If I don't want to be your friend anymore, I don't have to be your friend. I can boycott you. I can cut you
Correct.
dead. Cut you dead doesn't mean kill you. It just means ignore you or avoid.
Right.
So those would be the three principles. And now what we have is four elements or levels of libertarianism. And in my claim, the anarcho-capitalist really rigidly, maniacally adheres to these, all three. And the other three, in descending order, adhere to them, but less and less as we go down the list of libertarianism. But they're all
Right.
libertarians.
Okay.
So the next one below anarcho-capitalist would be minarchism. And by the way, the people most associated with anarcho-capitalism would be Murray Rothbard. He
Right.
is the Mr. Libertarian of that level of libertarianism. The next level below would be mostly associated with people like Ayn Rand and Robert Nozick. And this is called minarchism, minimal government libertarianism. And here, there is a government justified. And anarcho-capitalists don't believe in government because government taxes people. And when did we agree to pay taxes? We never
Right.
agree. I didn't agree. And somehow they're taxing me. So this violates a little bit the principles of libertarianism. And here there is one legitimate task of government, and that is to protect the people against murder, rape, theft, and all that. And to that end, there is a legitimate government which has only three aspects. One aspect is armies, to keep foreign bad guys off of us, to make sure they don't invade our country. The next one would be police, to make local rapists and murderers behave,
Right.
capture them, punish them. And the third would be courts, to determine who owns that headphone that you're wearing, or
Exactly. Right.
who is the good guy, who is the bad guy. The next level down I would call constitutionalism, and the person most associated with that in my mind is Ron Paul. Why is this a little lower? Because in the US Constitution, in addition to armies, courts, and police, they allow government roads and post offices and a few other things. But, what the heck? It's very close. And then the next fourth level down would be classical liberalism. And the people most associated with that would be Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek, who are staunch free marketeers, but allow even more than armies, courts, and police, and roads and post offices. They allow a little bit of welfare, a teeny little bit of not for everybody, but for really people who are in trouble, widows and orphans and people like that. And a little bit of regulation, very, very minimal regulation. And those are the four levels. And I would say of the four, of all people calling themselves libertarians, one 1% would be anarcho-capitalists, and the other three would each have about 33%, give or
Right.
take.
Right.
And the people who mostly converted people to libertarianism would be Ayn Rand for my generation, Ron Paul maybe for your generation, maybe Milton Friedman and Hayek for uh, your children or my grandchildren's age. So that would be the ballpark and the ball players of libertarianism, and that's where anarcho-capitalism fits in with the other three levels.
Right. No, that's a fascinating ladder that you've created there. I was also interested in your examples that you gave for each. So you were a little bit off generationally. My magnet into libertarianism was Milton Friedman. So to that extent, but I typically refer to myself as a minarchist. So it's interesting to me how you bucketed all those examples. And again, not that I don't want to necessarily spend a lot of time on that, but it was interesting to me the way you did that. So let me ask you this question: even among libertarians, the ANCAPs you estimate roughly, is like 1% of all libertarians, and by that I mean the people that I would assume Walter Block would define as true ANCAPs, right? Um, do you feel that by its nature, anarcho-capitalism is too radical for the overwhelming majority of people? That people who might otherwise agree or who believe in pure voluntarism in the free market might still, for example, say it's great if our community, we have a community of anarchists, but the world is not filled with community of anarchists. There's aggressors, there's people who, there's socialists, there's communists, et cetera, et cetera. Do you feel perhaps that's the stumbling block to being an ANCAP, even amongst the libertarian tribes that you enumerated?
Well, under ANCAP, we're not pacifists. We believe
Understood.
that if you're a criminal, we're going to come kick your butt. Uh, Only it wouldn't be government; it would be private defense agencies that would.
How would private defense agencies, and I don't mean to be too argumentative, but I need the thought process here. Say I'm Israel. I'm a bunch of Israelis. Obviously, the situation with Hamas, we could get into a deeper discussion a little bit later. Um, a small community of ANCAPs, for example, cannot reasonably be expected to defend against a nation, say, of an aggressor communist nation, say, neighboring them. I understand the concept that in your community with community, individual to individual, I see that possibly playing out. I don't see it where you have a group of individuals trying to live peaceably with complete voluntarism, and then adjacent to them you have an aggressive nation state that does not care about individuals and is only acting as a collective, as a super union. Isn't it a numbers game at that point where you say you can't have the ANCAPs in that situation? They're just outnumbered.
Well, let me answer that in two parts.
Sure.
The first part would be domestic. Right now, there are more private cops than government cops. You go to a mall, and there's
Yes.
no government cop unless there's some emergency. There's the mall cop. You go to Disneyland, there are cops there. Sometimes
Sure.
they're dressed as mice and ducks, but there are cops there who
Yes,
have
sir.
guns, and
Yep.
because Disney World doesn't want Jack the Ripper to do his thing there, and
Bad for business.
so there are private cops, and there would be private defense agencies, and I think they would do a better job of stopping the local murderers and rapists and thieves than the government cops, because a lot of what the government cops do now is they deal with victimless crimes like
Correct.
prostitution or pornography or drinking alcohol or
Right.
marijuana or whatever it is, whereas the private cops wouldn't do that. What the private cop is there for to do is to stop aggression, initiation of violence.
Sure.
Okay, now let's take the case of, well, how could these guys deal with a foreign enemy? Well, they could amalgamate. They could say, look, right now there are 3,200 uh, uh, private agencies in the United States. But if the Russians start attacking us, we will have a committee, and we'll all get together and work together.
Hmm.
Let me give you a real life example. You mentioned Israel. In 1948, before the state of Israel started, there was the Irgun. There was the two or three other groups like that um, uh, that um, that fought successfully. I mean, Israel started in 48, but there was hardly any government yet. It was these private defense agencies, like the Irgun would be just one example, and there are
Right.
45 other examples, and they successfully fought off 5 or 6 or 7, I think, Arab armies. And then later, they all joined into the IDF, the Israel Defense Force. So there is a real world example of private defense agencies, if I could call them that,
Sure.
that successfully fought off national governments. So yes, numbers matter, but if we have a lot of defense agencies, and also they're more efficient because private is usually more efficient than government, because if private doesn't work out too well, they lose money and they go bankrupt and they're taken over by more efficient people. Whereas
Right.
in the government, if they screw up, my favorite example of that is I'm a professor at Loyola University, New Orleans, and
Hmm.
Katrina came in 2005. It didn't really hit New Orleans; it was 40 miles east, but 1,900 people died. Why? Because the levees fell. And who was in charge of the levees? The Army Corps of Engineers. Now, from a humanistic point of view, we focus on 1,900 needless deaths. But as economists, what we focus on is that these people are still in business. Whereas if the Mississippi River Corporation owned the Mississippi River and its
Right.
levees fell, we would sue their rear ends off, and there'd be new management. If McDonald's, God forbid, killed 1,900 people with bad burgers, there'd be no more McDonald's. We go to Burger King or
Hmm.
Wendy's or whatever. So uh, don't look at it and think that, well, private defense agencies would be small and weak. They could be, but that would be a failure. But they need not be, and there are weak governments too. So I think if you have to weigh the two, ANCAP comes out ahead.
However, can you see where in the minds of the average Joe that might be an issue,
Oh
like a
yeah.
barrier to ANCAP?
Well, now you're really asking another question. The way I see it, I'm going to interpret your
Sure.
question as, what's the best way to convert people to libertarianism? Should you hit them with a wet fish in the face with ANCAP, or should you go softly, gently with Milton Friedman and Hayek and maybe even
Yeah.
Ron Paul and Ayn
Yeah.
Rand?
Yeah.
And my answer to that is an Austrian economist, and we're big into subjectivism, and there's no one right way. Yes, uh, Ayn Rand was not nice.
From what I've never met her, obviously, but from interviews that I've seen and tales told, yourself included in some other shows, yeah, she didn't give the vibe of being like the old Jewish grandmother that you would go to for rugula. You know what I mean? She did not have that quality to her. I don't think.
She did not suffer fools gladly,
Okay, fair enough. Yeah.
whereas Ron Paul is a sweetie pie. I
Okay.
mean, he's just exudes niceness. He's sort of saintly in
Hmm.
persona. And Milton Friedman and Hayek each have their own personalities. Now, you came in through the portals of Milton Friedman, but then you rejected it and took over Ayn Rand and minarchism and Robert Nozick. But I would say there is no one best way to convert people to libertarianism. Some people need a smack, and other people need a gentle thing. Well, look, you believe we should privatize the post office, right?
Oh,
Well,
sure, absolutely. Yeah.
Henry Hazlitt would explain about efficiency, and you believe we should have private sanitation. Well,
Yeah.
why not private roads? One of my books.
Right.
40,000 people a year die on the government highways, and now you believe in roads. Well, how about this? And gently we suck you in, and while you're not looking, we convert you to libertarianism. I mean,
Yeah.
we're not doing all that well because what what percentage of the electorate is libertarian? 1% usually.
Well, I actually think that's an actual interesting question as well. From what I could tell, and some anecdotal polling, if you ask American people issue by issue, without attaching it to a political party or to a voting bloc, they end up being largely libertarian, right? They're like,
I wouldn't say largely. I would say the numbers are something like 20%.
I was going to say it's the largest identifiable block. I would say it's not like a majority. I saw it somewhere near 27, but I won't quibble over the actual percentage. But the people who I would identify as libertarian issue by issue, probably it's way over people who actually act on those beliefs. So I'll agree with you 100% there. So to that extent, how do you view this is more of a I don't know, maybe it's a talking over two beers type of question, but if I came in with the Chicago school influence, if I came in with the Milton Friedman school influence, I sit and talk to Walter Block, I sit and talk to Rothbard if he were here, and somehow I get stuck on the Chicago school. I don't move past the Chicago school. I don't become an Austrian economist. In your mind, is that any sort of victory, or is that still a no-go in sense of that person, after talking to you, did not move further along the spectrum towards that upper level that you describe as ANCAP?
Well, there are ANCAPs who are Chicagoans. David Friedman, son of Milton Friedman, is an ANCAP, and he's a Chicagoan. He's not an Austrian. So the two issues are very different. Libertarianism is a theory of what is just law. Economics is a theory of what causes what. How do we understand and explain the economic reality? And the two are very different. One is a normative issue, libertarianism. The other is in economics called a positive issue. It's a science. So I would say that the two are very different. You can have an ANCAP Chicagoan, and you can have a classical liberal who is an Austrian. So you don't want to conflate the two. They're very, very different. Now, it's true that most Austrians are ANCAPs. So there is a correlation, but it's not a logical correlation. It's sort of like, I don't know, red.
It's a preferential. Yeah, I was going to say it's a preferential association there. It's not drawn from logic. It's drawn from either just practical implementation or something to that effect, right?
Right. Well, now I am not only a libertarian of the ANCAP variety, but I'm also an Austrian economist, and I would like to give a 2-minute lecture on why.
Feel free, Professor.
On why Austrianism is better than Chicagoism.
Sure.
Not as a libertarian thing, but as economics.
Sure.
And there are many, many differences. Now, here you get Hayek, who is an Austrian, and Friedman, who is a Chicagoan, but they're both roughly the same level of libertarianism, the lowest level of libertarianism in terms of adherence to the three principles I mentioned, but they diverge on economics. So where would Austrianism be preferable to Chicagoism? First, why do they call it Austrianism? Why do they call it Chicagoism? The reason they call it's got nothing to do with the economics of the country Austria, nor the economics of the city Chicago. It's rather that the people who started Austrian economics just happen to live in Austria. Von Beauvert, Mises, Menger, Hayek, they all lived in Austria. Similarly with Chicago economics, got nothing to do with the city of Chicago.
The university. Yeah.
It's just that Milton Friedman and Stigler were all at the University of Chicago. So, that's the reason. Okay, so one divergence between the two, to me, the most important divergence is a matter of a thing called the synthetic a priori. What this means is our economic Is economics limited to hypotheses which have to be tested and can be falsified? Or in addition, are there apodictic necessary truths in economics? The Chicagoans are empiricists, and they would say that there's no such thing as an economic law. There are only hypotheses, and now some of the hypotheses have been proven over and over and over again, or evidence has been given for them, and overwhelming evidence, like the minimum wage law, creates unemployment for unskilled workers. The Chicagoans and the Austrians would all agree to that. But what is the status of it? Is it a necessary truth, or is it something that is just a hypothesis? And the next time we do an empirical examination, it could turn out the other way. And the Chicagoans say, yes, it never has, but it could be. It wouldn't be a logical contradiction to say that the minimum wage was implemented and the unemployment rate of unskilled workers went down.
Right.
It would be unusual. We wouldn't believe it for a moment. We would look at the data much more carefully, but it's not a logical contradiction like a square circle. Whereas for the Austrians, it's a logical contradiction like a square circle.
That's interesting. I've never heard it put that way. And that helps explain, like on a very high level, I think, the difference between the two. Because as you were talking and giving that example of the minimum wage, what popped in my head was something an old physics professor once said. He goes, according to theory, all the molecules of air could randomly rush into the opposite corner of the room and we'd all suffocate instantly. But it's never happened, and it's unlikely to ever happen. But it remains a possibility, right? So what you're saying is the Chicago school, if I can apply that to that example, would say we need to test every so often to make sure that the molecules didn't rush to the other end of the room. Whereas the Austrian would say, don't waste your time.
Well, not on the molecules, but on
right.
Look, I'm now going to offer you $100 for your headphones, which I've been admiring.
Right.
And let's suppose that you agree, and I buy the headphones for $100, and you sell the headphones for $100. As an Austrian, I want to say that necessarily, apodictically, untestably, unfalsifiably, I gain ex ante. Namely, I preferred at the time of purchase, I preferred the headphones to the $100.
Correct.
You also gain because you valued the $100 more than the headphones.
Correct.
And we don't have to test this, and it's not falsifiable. It's necessarily true. And to deny this is like saying that square circles exist, or 2 + 2 is 17, or something like that. Whereas for the Austrians, they would say, for the Chicagoans, they'd say, well, not so fast. And they could come up with some sort of weird thing where it didn't work. No.
Gotcha.
So that's one difference.
Okay.
Another difference is on the business cycle. We Austrians don't believe that the economy is subject to either inflation or unemployment. See, the way the mainstream see it, the economy is like a car on a very narrow road. And if you get off the ditch in one sense, you're going to get into unemployment. You get off the ditch on the other side, you're going to get inflation. And now the mainstream diverge into left-wing Keynesians and right-wing Keynesians. And the right-wing Keynesians, in my view, are Chicagoans. Because what the left-wing Keynesians say is the way to keep the car on the straight and narrow road is with fiscal policy, taxes and expenditure. The monetarists, the Chicagoans, would say, no. Yes, the car is on a narrow road and it's subject to falling off in either direction. But the way to keep the car on the straight and narrow is through monetary policy. Whereas the Austrians say, look, the car is a lot more stable than that. It's not in danger. And the reason we have business cycles is because of government intervention in the first place. Right. If there were no government intervention in the first place, there wouldn't be any business cycle. So that would be another divergence. And you could see why the Austrian is much more compatible with radical libertarianism, because Chicagoans are saying that the economy is very unstable and needs government intervention of a monetarist variety,
right?
Because the Austrians aren't. But still, you can have mainstream economists who are ANCAP, and you can have Austrians who are not.
Mm.
So that would be a second divergence. Let me just give one more, because
Sure.
this is supposed to be more on libertarianism than economics, but just one more.
Sure.
Then we can get into other libertarian issues. One more would be antitrust. The mainstream believes in antitrust, that if you get so big, you can be anti-competitive. The Austrians say, that's nonsense. If
Correct.
McDonald's outcompetes Burger King and Wendy's and pizza and every other fast food, and now if you want fast food, you got to go to McDonald's, that's fine. Whereas the Chicagoans and the mainstream people would say, oh, no, this is anti-competitive. So that would be another divergence between the two.
Oh, it's interesting. I thought I could be wrong about this. I thought someone like Friedman said that he wasn't necessarily against monopolies, especially since he felt most monopolies were the result of bad government policy. I could be wrong about that, but
No,
but
no,
but I take your point that monopolies in and of themselves, if they arrive at their market dominance without government intervention, it's not necessarily a bad thing.
well, I would correct your language a little bit. I would
Sure.
say, as an Austrian, the only monopolies are government monopolies, because what a
Fair
monopoly
enough.
means is not a single seller. A monopoly means that if you compete with me, I put you in jail.
Right. Okay.
That's what a
Yeah.
monopoly is, and that can only be government. Uh,
Correct. Yeah.
what Friedman is saying is that single sellerness, or cornering the market and being the only burger place or the only steel mill or the only automobile manufacturer, is problematic. And what the Austrians are saying, no, it's not problematic. If the only car is the Honda, because the Honda beat out every other brand of car, that's no problem. And mergers, yeah, anyone should be able to merge with anyone else. Whereas
Sure.
Friedman would say, no. If you have too much concentration of an industry, there are utilitarian losses. And now Friedman is very clever. And what he says is the antitrust people shouldn't pursue every merger, because pursuing mergers costs money. It takes a lot of lawyers, a lot of court
Right.
time, and we should only pursue mergers, namely stop mergers, if the dead weight loss or the inefficiency of the merger is greater than the cost of stopping it. So it's a little twist, very clever on Friedman's part, and eminently reasonable. But I would say that he's wrong initially in thinking that there's some sort of welfare loss if you have concentration. Remember, the third aspect of libertarianism is free association. So
Right.
if the Big John and the Little Walter Company want to merge, it should be nobody's business. There should be no question of is it anti-competitive or not, or what. It should just be allowed as a part of freedom. That would be the libertarian aspect, and also as a part of economic sense.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Excuse me. Is there any possibility that Friedman's position on that specific matter was more related to a single seller, not from a legal perspective, but from the perspective of stifling innovation, in the sense that without competition, things tend to stagnate, right? Like, was there concern maybe from that aspect, or in your, and I mean, obviously you would have dealt with Milton Friedman a lot more personally than I ever have, but was that the concern, as opposed to, well, some mergers are worse than others type of thing?
Well, again, I diverge from your use of language, your use of the word competition. I would say that you're making the mistake that Friedman makes, namely conflating competition with number of competitors.
Yes.
In a single seller case, there's only one competitor, but there's plenty of competition. Because what I mean by competition is it legal to enter the market? Will you go to jail if you enter the market? And look,
Correct.
if in New York City they have yellow cabs, and those are the only legal cabs. And if you take your private automobile and stick something on top of the roof and say Big John Cab Company, you go to jail.
Yes,
So
sir.
there are many, many yellow cab drivers. I don't know, 20,000. So there are many competitors, but there's no competition because there's no free entry. And by free entry, I don't mean costless entry. I mean legal entry. The post
Right.
office, John, you and I are now going to set up a company to deliver first class mail, and we go to jail
Yes.
because there is a monopoly.
Yeah. 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 I see what you mean by that. So, the language I used was inappropriate, but like to your point, the taxi cabs in New York, I remember in the Bronx, we never took a yellow cab, right? We always took the gypsy cabs because they were faster, they were cheaper, they were on every block. They went to places in the city where the yellow cabs wouldn't necessarily go. So that market sprang up organically. And like to your point, I guess, even though it's illegal in New York City to do that, they operated almost in open. It wasn't a secret, right? But we know that those operated. Okay, great. Thank you for that. Now, moving on to defending the undefendable. I'm tempted to say as a child, because like I said, I'm almost 60 now, and I know I'm still a child in your eyes, but intellectually and age-wise, probably. But when I was younger in high school, one of the things that was happening around time was the political correctness in the workplace was just starting to spring up, say the late 70s, early 80s type of time frame. And I always remember the one case, and I remember as a young teenager, say 12, 13 years old, saying like, you would read these cases of secretary sues boss, to use general language, because he made her go get him his coffee, or he made her go shop for his wife's birthday present or anniversary present, etc., etc. And I remember as a 12-year-old saying, well, is the only problem in this situation that he didn't tell her that would be part of being a secretary? His secretary specifically? Is it some sort of breach of contract? Or is it that there's this societal issue that says you shouldn't treat women in that fashion in the workplace? And it kind of ruminated in my stupid head, bounced around a little bit. If I ever uttered it out to my high school teachers or something, they'd call me a sexist, and I'd have to be reprogrammed away from my Greek male chauvinism or whatever, haha, funny. But your book, very interestingly, gives credence to that sort of thought by saying, like, hey, I'll let you explain it. How would you have answered a young Big John if he brought that objection to you?
Well, first, the reason I was turning my back to you is I have my book, Defending the Undefendable, in my bookcase, and I wanted to grab it. So can I take 1 second and maybe...
Sure, absolutely. Go ahead. Yeah.
Let me see if I can find the book. Here I am back. Unfortunately, I only found 2 different versions of Defending the Undefendable 1. But I was looking for Defending the Undefendable 2 and 3. I'm now working on version 4, but I can't find the other ones. Probably they're in my other office. This was my first book. It came out in 1976, and it's still being published and bought and sold and all. How would I react to the early John who saw nothing wrong with a boss asking a secretary to get him a cup of coffee or to buy a present for his wife? Well, I agree with you. It really depends upon the contract. If the contract says that all she has to do, and here I'm being a sexist by thinking that the secretary is a woman, but usually secretaries are women.
Right.
All she has to do is type and file and do things like that. Well, if he asks for a cup of coffee, it's not part of the contract, and it is a violation of the contract. On the other hand, from time immemorial, secretaries have been getting coffee for their bosses, so it's sort of understood. I don't think it has to be explicitly mentioned. I mean, it's sort of like when I bought your headphones. You weren't going to rip them off, rip the wire off as you handed it to me. That was implicit in that you would
Right.
give me the whole thing in a workable order. So you don't have to specify those things. I mean, you can't specify everything in a contract because I won't say an infinite number of things that can happen, but an indefinitely large number of things. And I would say that if the secretary took umbrage at being asked to do this, she should be fired because the understanding would be that the secretary does those sorts of things in addition to filing and typing and stuff like that.
So is that to be understood in that specific case as being a contingent on the times, right? So at that point in time, say 1980, 79, 80, 81, that time frame, of necessity, would a secretary who sued her boss on that basis, like, he maybe get, whatever, initially your sort of response would be, well, no, everybody knows that's part of the job, but unless it was explicitly written out in some sort of employment contract. That aside, you're saying that implicitly society at that time understood that to be a function of that role in common understanding, but there may be a time where that common understanding is shifting, correct?
Well, I don't think it's shifted yet. Now, maybe in 20 years from now it'll shift, but I would say, if you hire a secretary and you sit her down and she's typing and doing something on a computer, nowadays she'd have to do something on a computer, not just on a typewriter.
Correct.
And you asked her for a cup of coffee. I think that even nowadays, she shouldn't be able to successfully sue you for anything because it's still implicit. Yes, there are feminists who would say that no, but my read, if I were a judge, I would say it's still implicit. Now, look, in 20 years, it might be that the feminists take over and somehow it's clear that a secretary should not be asked to do any of these other tasks. Well, then it would be a contract violation.
Gotcha. And in the cases that, like, or you use it as examples sometimes, where does competency of the parties come into play, if at all? Let me give you an example. A couple of years ago, my mother-in-law had a knock on the door. Someone came in and sold her an insurance policy. She was advanced in age, living alone, and as we found out, was starting to suffer from Alzheimer's at that point. However, she did sign her name to an agreement. In that situation, talk to me about the competency. I'm not going to use the word predatory because I don't necessarily believe in that, but in the sense that one could argue, look, she agreed to this. She put her name on a piece of paper on a contract. And then people would say, but she was clearly not in possession of her faculties. How in your construct does that resolve itself, if at all?
Well, you're now raising a legal question of continuums. So what's a continuum? We know that you got to have a statutory rape law. If you go to bed with a 5-year-old girl, you are a statutory rapist. I don't care if she agreed, because we don't think 5-year-old girls can agree to any such thing.
Correct.
On the other hand, you go to bed with a 25-year-old woman and she agrees, I don't care what you are, you're not a statutory rapist. Well, where do you draw the line?
Exactly, yeah.
Should it be 15, 16, I don't know, 14, 17? I don't know. And I do know that you can't derive an age from the basic libertarian principles. There's nothing in libertarianism that says, well, it's 16 years and 6 months. Because you can always say, well, there are girls who are more mature at age 15 than some other girls at age 17. And you just get into a gigantic morass. Where are you now physically right now? What city?
New York.
New York. I'm in Vancouver, British Columbia. I'm now going to punch you. If you send over a missile because because I threaten you, you're a murderer. because not only are we far away and we haven't met each other for too long, but we have a friendly relationship.
Right, right, right.
Oh, it's just a philosophical thing, and you're in no danger. Uh,
Correct.
on the other hand, if it's a dark alley and the light is glistening off of my watch, and you think it's a knife, and you shoot me, well, then you're justified. Well, how far away, in what context does it have to be that when I make this threat against you to punch you, that you can
Right.
take defensive action? It's a continuum problem. There's no right answer. You can't say it's 4 feet away. It depends on the context. If we're sort of friends, I'm not going to hurt
Right.
you, even if I'm 1 inch away from you. It would just be a philosophical sort of a thing.
Correct.
So
Right.
there's no right answer. I mean, if the insurance encyclopedia salesman or the insurance guy gets a 4-year-old to sign the contract, that's not viable. But
Right.
a woman, say in her 80s, well, it's a gray area. What the way you would do is you would go to court and you would say, look at this woman, give her a little test, or do you think
Right.
she's competent? And if the jury says she's competent, then she has to pay. And if the
Correct.
jury says she's not, then the insurance guy loses his contract.
Right. So, and I understand that principle. Obviously, someone has to decide if, in fact, this person was incompetent, right? And in our society right now, better or worse, that's a government court of some sort. But so it sounds like, yes, there is a, generally speaking.
Let me correct you. It need not be a government court. It could be the American Arbitration Association,
Fair enough.
which is
Yeah.
a private court.
Right. If both parties agree to it, correct? Yes. Okay. Yeah. Go to arbitration. Yes, absolutely. But it sounds like you do agree that there is room for considering the competency of the parties in any agreement.
Absolutely, sure. You can't make a contract with a 3-year-old boy uh, for buying encyclopedias or insurance policies.
Right. Right. Okay. Good. Good. Now, another thing that people find radical, I don't necessarily, because I kind of get it, is you always hear like, well, racial discrimination should be illegal. Now, while I find it personally, A, abhorrent, and B, non-beneficial to me, because I'm shutting off a revenue, potential customers, I'm shutting off potential people who might save my life one day, et cetera, et cetera. But on a legal perspective only, there are those who say, like, well, racial discrimination should be illegal, not lawful. I know what your answer is to that, but please formulate an answer for me, because this is a very sensitive subject, and then distinguish it from people perhaps that you may find unpalatable, who may just say promote racial discrimination.
I'm turning around because I bought a book on I wrote a book on this. I'm trying to find the book.
Okay.
This time I'm more successful. I did write a whole book on that.
The case for discrimination, yeah.
The case for discrimination. And I want to break this into two parts, the economics and the libertarianism part of it.
Sure.
And from the libertarianism part of it, this just follows directly from free association.
Correct.
Nobody should be forced to associate with anyone against his will. Now, look, I'm married, and I'm married to a woman. I know I'm a pervert, but I make no apologies. When I was looking for a spouse, I ignored all men, weirdo that I am. Namely, I discriminated against men because I didn't want to marry a man. I wanted to marry a woman.
Right.
Am I a criminal for this? Well, I should be, if the law applies not only to race, but also to gender. I discriminated. If you're really against discrimination, you can't be hetero, nor can you be homo, because hetero males like me discriminate against all the males. Hetero females discriminate against other women. Um, Homosexual men discriminate against half the human race, women. Lesbians discriminate against half the human race, men. Everyone would have to be a bisexual, because only bisexuals are legitimate. Now, any law that logically implies compulsory bisexuality, there's a problem with it.
Yes.
There's a big problem with it.
Right.
And this is the logic of laws against discrimination, whether on race or sexual preference or gender or height or whatever it is. I mean, I now discriminate against all men that have hair on their head, like you. I'm
Gotcha.
not allowing you in my restaurant.
Right.
Now, that's not a protected aspect.
Class. Yeah.
But it could be.
Right.
You know, and you discriminate against all bald men, which is also not a protected class. Well, why are some classes protected and others aren't? I mean, the whole thing is arbitrary and capricious and nonsense and subject to the reductio ad absurdum of compulsory bisexuality.
I agree with you wholeheartedly, but let me play devil's advocate here for you on the follow-up to what you just said, which, by the way, 100% in agreement with you. What if your racial, I'll take the word racial out. What if your discrimination results in harm coming to someone? Maybe not directly by your hand. Say, for example, a doctor who refuses to treat a critically injured person for whatever reason, race, religion, gender, whatever. I'm playing devil's advocate here. Should that be made illegal? Should that type of activity be unlawful, in your opinion?
Well, first of all, you mentioned the word harm. We libertarians believe that you are allowed to harm people, because you and I both wanted to date Mary Sue, and you're Big John, and you beat me out for the affections of Mary Sue, and you harmed me.
Yes.
And I'm going to sue you for harming me, and I'm going to sue her also. I mean, that's nonsense.
Correct.
Well, we're both car salesmen, and Mary Sue buys a car from me. Well, I harmed you. We're allowed to harm each other in many, many different ways. What we're not allowed to do is violate the rights of people. So the question comes, this doctor who refused to treat me because I'm bald, he harmed me. But did he violate my rights? No, he didn't violate my rights, because he has no positive obligation. In libertarianism, there's no positive obligation. There are only negative obligations. Don't hit me, don't kill me, don't burn me, don't steal from me. But there are no obligations for him to help me. Otherwise, I mean, there is no compulsory good Samaritanism in libertarianism. If there were, you and I would now be murderers. Because there are people in Africa who are starving to death, let's say, and we're both sitting here fat and happy, if I can use that word, relatively to starving people.
Sure.
So we're murderers. So first of all, let's talk about this harm business. You're allowed to harm people. You're just not allowed to violate their rights. And there's no compulsion for any doctor to help anyone. That would be slavery, a version of slavery, if he was obligated to help me whether he wanted to or not. I mean, suppose his own wife was also in dire need, and he chose her over me. He harmed me, but if he were my slave, I would order him to help me and not his wife. But we're against this sort of slavery.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, now I answered this question so far just on the basis of libertarianism. Now let me answer it on the basis of economics. And there were three gurus of mine. Two of them happen to be black, which is irrelevant, but Walter Williams, who I'm proud to say is a co-author of mine, and Thomas Sowell, who I'm proud to say is a contributor to a volume that I edited, and Gary Becker, who was my PhD dissertation advisor at Columbia. These three have done more than any other three in terms of the economics of discrimination. I don't know if I dedicate this book to them or not. I probably should have, and I'm not going to look now because I don't want to embarrass myself, but I should have. Maybe I did. Who knows? Um, and what they say is that discrimination doesn't harm people. Now, it has a right to do it on libertarian grounds, but it doesn't really harm people. Look, let's take the case of the pay gap between men and women as an example of sexual discrimination that harms women, supposedly,
Right.
as a case in point. I mean, we talked about racial discrimination, talked about homosexual. Now let's bring in male-female.
Sure.
For every dollar a man makes, a woman makes something like 70 cents, give or take. Sometimes it's 75,
Right.
sometimes 65, sometimes 80. It varies, but let's pick 30% wage gap as a nice round number. And the idea here on the part of the plaintiffs or the complainants is that men are in charge of businesses and men are prejudiced against women. I tell you, most men that I know are not prejudiced against women because they're hetero and they're not prejudiced against women. But
No, they're not.
Most hetero men that I know are not at all. But let's suppose they are. And the reason that women make less than men is because men are in charge. Who knows how they got in charge? But they're in charge, and they just deprecate women. They look at a woman and they say, well, she's incompetent. I'll hire a man. And therefore, the demand curve for women shifts to the left, would be the way you'd put it in economics. Mm-hmm. And with a given supply curve, they make less money. That's the argument in favor of the discrimination hypothesis. What's the counter argument? The counter argument is that whenever you do anything, you do it at the cost of not being able to do anything else as well or at all. My dramatic examples of this is Yo-Yo Ma and Usain Bolt. Okay. Yo-Yo Ma is the best cellist on the planet. Usain Bolt is a world-class sprinter. I think he's got the world's record, 9.3 in the 100.
Something crazy like that.
They ought to give him a speeding ticket for going so fast.
Right.
What's Yo-Yo Ma's ability to play the cello? Not much. What's Yo-Yo Ma's time in the 100? I'll bet you and I could beat him. I don't know. But the point is, why is Yo-Yo Ma a lousy sprinter? Because he doesn't do things that make you a good sprinter. He plays the cello all day. He doesn't lift weights. He doesn't jump. He doesn't do things like that. Why is Usain Bolt a lousy cellist? Because he doesn't play the cello. He works out in the gym. He lifts weights. He jumps. He does whatever he does. Whenever you do anything, you do it at the cost. It's called alternative costs or opportunity costs of not being able to do something else as well as otherwise you could have done if you weren't specializing in what you're doing. Okay. What's going on in the household? Who is taking care of babies? Who is shopping and cooking and cleaning and breastfeeding? Is it the men or the women? It's the women. Women have a greater affinity for children than men do. When my son was born, my wife has very sharp elbows. She was worried that I'd hurt the baby. There's an affinity between women and children. And women do the lion's share of cooking and cleaning and all sorts of stuff with children.
Right.
Well, whenever you do anything, you do it at the cost of not being able to do something else as well.
Right.
Now, there are two proofs or two bits of evidence as to why it is that women are making less money than men. First of all, 100 years ago or 200 years ago, you can see, by the way, I have to get off into another point. What determines wages in the first place? What determines wages in the first place is productivity levels. Mm-hmm. Right now, the NBA is having their
playoffs. Yeah.
Playoffs. What do those guys make? $50 million a year if they're very good, $30 million a year if they're mediocre, $10 million a year if they're bench sitters. Why do they make so much money? Because they're very productive. They put rear ends in seats to watch them dunk a basketball.
Right.
Why do you and I make a middle class salary, somewhere maybe six figures, maybe close to
Yeah.
it? Because our productivity is mediocre.
Yeah. Yeah.
Why?
Well, even in your example, Walter, compare the WNBA to the NBA.
Yes.
Why do the female basketball players make so much less, or the female soccer players compared to their male counterparts? Has nothing to do with gender discrimination. It's the men typically the men's leagues end up subsidizing the women's leagues just to stay in business, So yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, the wage gap is complete nonsense, honestly. My answer to that is, well, show me those women who really earn 70% less, and I'd start a company of just women, because I have a 30% profit built in from day one, right? If their argument was true.
That was one of the proofs I was going to give you.
Oh, okay. I didn't mean to steal your thunder, Walter, but
that's a very good argument. Namely, if it were really true that they had equal productivity, they would somebody would raise their wage. I mean, if a man
Right.
is making 10 and a woman is making 7 an hour, and they're equally productive, I'll offer the woman 701. You'll offer the woman 702. Where will this end?
Right. Well, it ends in a bidding war, which is what it should end in, honestly. It was interesting. I was talking to Stephen Kinsella last episode, and when I brought up this issue to him, he actually said, which was an interesting sort of response. I haven't heard it from a lot of people, where he said, these Good Samaritan laws, he said, I don't think they should exist, but if they do exist, I don't think they're the worst laws in the world, in the sense that they wouldn't be at the top of his list of laws to eliminate. And I thought that was an interesting response. Just in general, just to sidetrack you a little bit, what do you think of a response like that?
Well, I agree. I think that the fact that the post office is government owned is not the first thing I would change.
Right.
If I became president. And this equal pay is not the first thing I change. The government does a lot worse things than that. But let me continue on this, because I haven't given my full.
Thing. Sure. Let's get that.
Look, 100 or 200 years ago, you could see why there'd be a wage gap, because a lot of jobs required upper body strength. The way we cut down trees was with a saw, and the way we dug a hole in the ground for a pipeline was with a pick and shovel. And men are stronger than women, on average. Now, look, there are some women shot putters who are way stronger than you and I, but on average, men are stronger than women, and they're more productive with a pick and shovel or with a saw than.
Right.
But nowadays, the way we cut down trees is with a electric buzz saw.
Yeah, electric saw, yeah.
Women can press the button as well as men, and ditto with steam shovels. So why now is it that there's such a gap? And it's because of this marital asymmetry hypothesis. Namely, women do the lion's share. And one proof of this is just what you said, that if there were a gap and the productivity were the same, the gap would end. The second bit is, this 30% gap is all men versus all women. But there are certain men and certain women who have never been married, not widowed, not divorced, not separated, just never married. And you know what the gap is between them?
Oh, it's nothing.
Zero.
Zero. Yeah.
Well, I shouldn't say zero, because the ratio sometimes is 0.9 and sometimes it's 1.1, depending upon the age and the country and this and that and the other. I was in a competition with Walter Williams and Thomas Sowell. I was in Canada at the time, working for the Fraser Institute, and we were trying to come up with the highest ratio of women to men, where there was a wage gap against men. And I think I got 1.1 or something like that. So those are the two proofs, or the two evidences that what's going on here is not hurting women. Discrimination is not hurting women. It's different productivity. So that would be my complete answer to the question.
Yeah, and that definitely fits in with a lot of what I've heard Sowell say on the subject, like that. His big thrust is exactly what you mentioned. It's not enough to look at single or married. It's continuous time in the workplace. That at any given snapshot, a woman might identify herself as single or unmarried, but did you spend 12 consecutive years or 15 consecutive years, or did you take time off to get married, to get divorced, to raise a child? And then hours work tend to favor men. They tend to work longer hours and are willing to travel more and things like that. So to the extent that any sort of gap exists, there are things outside of gender that account for it, I think, much more reasonably than just as you described. So yeah, thank you for that.
Absolutely.
What now, let me ask you this. I want to start wrapping it up a little bit. You were a senior fellow at the Mises Institute. You are no longer a senior fellow at the Mises Institute. Are you still associated with them in any way, by the way?
Well, they from time to time invite me to give a speech, and I'm now scheduled. I don't know if I'm still scheduled or if I'm going to be disinvited, but I am scheduled to speak at a supportive summit in October.
Mm,
I don't know if that'll be rescinded. I asked, but I didn't get an answer.
okay.
And also, I think I'd be invited to the Austrian seminars where anyone is invited. You don't have to be a senior fellow. So I am, and I still blog at the Mises Institute, and Lou Rockwell still publishes me on lourockwell.com. So I think my disassociation with the Mises Institute is only that I'm no longer a senior fellow. But I don't think I've been banned from. No one has said never enter these doors again. I think I'm
Okay.
still welcome there.
Okay. Thank you for that clarification. Now, as I understood it, as I've heard you comment before, this you're no longer being a senior fellow was the result of your positions on the Israel-Hamas conflict, correct? Is that accurate to say?
Well, not exactly accurate. Tom DiLorenzo, the new president, who, by the way, is an old friend of mine for I don't know how many decades and a
Mm,
co-author of mine many, many times, and sort of a friend of the family. When my daughter was getting her PhD at Hopkins, he was also in Baltimore, and he was very nice to her. He wrote me a very acerbic letter saying, "You're no longer a senior fellow because of your views on war." But that's
mm,
not true. My views on war are the same as any other libertarian, namely, we favor defensive wars, wars of secession, wars where somebody else attacks you. We just don't favor offensive wars. So my views on war are the same as any decent libertarian. Where we diverge is on Israel versus Hamas. The people at the Mises Institute evidently think that Hamas is the victim and Israel is the perpetrator of the war, whereas I, a Zionist, take the opposite point of view. So we don't disagree on war, we disagree on a specific war, namely the present war now undergoing between Hamas and Israel.
Is the position, to your understanding, is the position of someone like Mr. DiLorenzo that Israel is not engaged in a defensive war?
Yeah, they're engaged in an offensive war, would be my understanding. And offensive wars are illegitimate. They've killed, I don't know, according to Hamas figures, which I'm not sure we should take full value, they've killed 30,000 people, among whom there are many civilians and women and children. And this is certainly non kosher, if I could put it
Sure.
in those terms. And I think, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but my understanding is that he and Lou Rockwell and many of the leaders of the Mises Institute think that Israel is in the wrong. Maybe October 7th shouldn't have happened. I'm not sure what their view on that is. But if it happened, it was because of Israel making, Gaza into an open air prison. Certainly, this would be the view of Hans Hoppe, who is certainly not officially a leader of the Mises Institute, but at least unofficially a leader of the
Right.
Mises Institute. And he wrote a blistering critique of me and Alan Fuderman, who is my co-author, saying that I'm some sort of weirdo, maniacal, evil person. Those aren't exactly his words. Paraphrase. Very nasty letter, and I wrote a response with Alan Fuderman, and saying that this sort of language is not scholarly, and we're scholars, and the only way to get to the truth is through scholarship, and making the case that the Palestinians were wrong.
Sort of extrapolating from what you just said, do you think that in recent years, and this also touches on politics, not necessarily libertarian philosophy, pure and simple, but do you feel that there's any validity to the assessment of the political nature right now, that there is a sort of a rising tide of anti-Semitism involved with the, I don't know, I don't want to say the Mises Institute per se, but say those who identify themselves as either Rothbardians or ANCAPs, and do you see like a nationalist trend coming out of that right now in recent years? Or, I mean, also like if you look to immigration, I would have thought that sort of the ANCAP position would be open immigration for all, free movement of people, services, and goods. Whereas now there seems to be a closed border stance. There seems to be a rise in anti-Semitism. Is it my perception that's off, Walter, or do you think that this is something tangible that's been happening in recent years?
Well, I don't think that there's a scintilla of anti-Semitism in the Mises Institute. Remember, the Mises Institute is named after Mises. Mises was Jewish.
Yes.
A more accurate name for the Mises Institute, a friendly amendment, might be the Mises Rothbard Institute, in the sense that Rothbard also is very instrumental in leading the Mises Institute.
Mm-hmm.
Roosevelt was also Jewish. David Gordon is a key player in the Mises Institute. He's Jewish. I am Jewish. They knew I was Jewish. And before this Israeli thing came up, I was a senior fellow. So it's really difficult to see any scintilla of anti-Semitism on the part of the Mises Institute. However, I think that there is a lot of anti-Semitism at Columbia University and at many of these other universities, where pretty much anything Israel does is bad, and anything done to Israel is good because it's colonialist enterprise. And I think at the UN, there have been more complaints about Israel than all other countries put together double. Well, when you get that, what do they say? Where there's smoke, there's fire. So I think that in the general public, there is some anti-Semitism, and it's coming out more and more with this Hamas war. But I don't think it's at all involved with the Mises Institute. And by the way, I still think of the Mises Institute the way I thought of it before. We disagree on this one issue, but we don't disagree on much else. I take that back. There are other issues where libertarians disagree. Voluntary slavery, reparations to blacks for slavery, immigration, abortion. Murray Rothbard was pro-choice. Ron Paul was pro-life. You can't get two more highly credentialed libertarians than Ron Paul and Murray Rothbard. That would be impossible. A logical contradiction. I'm kidding about that, but only half kidding.
Right.
Yet they were 180 degrees apart, and yet never a uncivil word was traded between the two of them, nor in any of their followers. And yet somehow the Israeli thing, Murray Rothbard and Ron Paul can't both be right because they're taking the opposite point of view. By the way, I don't want to get into evictionism, but I think evictionism is the only correct view, that Murray and Ron were wrong on this.
Yeah, if I had another hour, I would talk to you about evictionism, but we're not going to do it right now.
But the point is, there's some sort of Israeli derangement syndrome going on.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah,
where people can talk about immigration and abortion politely, and you made this point, but how about that? And scholarly, polite, and nobody's canceling anyone. But when it comes to the Israeli war with Hamas, there's a derangement syndrome going on, sort of like Trump derangement syndrome, where, Hans Hoppe and I have been friends for as long as me and Tom DiLorenzo. And we're many times co-authors. And all of a sudden, I'm a maniac.
Yeah, that's interesting to me, because in talking to you right now, I'm not going to pretend like we've known each other for decades, but in talking to you right now, I don't get the sense of someone who is anything other than discussing in an academic fashion. Like even if you disagree, even if you and I disagree, I'm not gonna berate you. I'm not gonna run down your appearance. You're not gonna make fun of me or whatever. We're having a discussion. And perhaps after this discussion, we can virtually shake hands. Hopefully, we may call each other acquaintances after this, and be and happily just say we disagree on some issues. However, politically at least, I see like so much. I don't know if hatred's the right word, or derision, or I don't know recently. And I'm disappointed as a libertarian politically because I thought we were above that. And I fully admit, maybe I was being naive, Pollyannish, whatever you want to say. But I'm sitting here talking to you. I feel I don't get the sense that you're berating anyone. I don't get the sense that you're being derisive of anyone. And it's in your voice. I kind of hear a little bit of disappointment if I can sort of infer what you're saying. You know, it's not just that they disagree with me on my position. It's all of a sudden that I've become the antichrist to them in some way, that because I hold this position, I am now, I'm not going to say persona non grata, but, you know, I'm no longer a senior fellow, call that whatever you will. I see the same thing sort of on immigration as well. You know, the policy where, you know, I can listen to a Jacob Hornberger talk to me about there should be open borders, and at the same time, he'll get on the debate stage and literally be mocked for an hour by some of the other candidates for holding that position. And I'm saying, like, the man is not stating anything that's inconsistent with libertarianism, at least in my view. We might have varying degrees of open borders, and I would assume, correct me if I'm wrong, Walter, that you would be pro open immigration, right? Like free movement of people. Am I correct in that assumption?
Well, I think we're going to need another hour for it because my views are a little complicated.
Sure.
But I am an open borders libertarian. On the other hand, there are certain immigrants who, when they come here, they see a woman in a miniskirt and they say, aha, let's rape her to show her that she should wear a habib or whatever.
Yeah.
And we don't really want people like that. So what I want
Correct.
is to have our cake and eat it too. I want open immigration, and I also want to keep people like that out of here. And there are murderers and rapists, not
Sure.
only logical ones. So my view is a little bit more complicated. My view is, and here I have 4 books on this. I have privatization of highways, privatization of oceans, privatization of space, and privatization. Well, let me take a minute or two to explain this. Look, suppose somebody comes from Mars, and he starts homesteading in an area in the middle of the Rocky Mountains in Wyoming, or in the middle of Alaska. And he knocks down a tree, and this is virgin territory that nobody's ever been there before. And he plants some corn, and he domesticates a cow, and he starts homesteading, and along comes some cop from ICE, the
immigration, yeah.
Immigration authorities, and they say, you know, get out. You're violating U.S. law. And the Martian says, yeah, I'm violating U.S. law, right? But am I violating any libertarian law? And the answer is no. Now, Hans Hoppe and I have disputed this. And what Hans says is, yes, you are violating law because the U.S. government owns that land, even though it's not been homesteaded in behalf of all the people. And I say, Hans, you're an anarchist. What's this U.S.
Yeah.
What's this U.S. government crap?
Right. Right.
I'm paraphrasing myself.
Sure.
In my scholarly articles, I don't do it quite that way.
Right. Right.
And you, Hans, have done more than pretty much anyone else on homesteading theory. This Martian is not violating libertarian principles. So how are we going to have our cake and eat it? How are we going to allow the Martian to engage in homesteading virgin territory, of which there's plenty? And a lot of the BLM land, Bureau of Land Management land, has never been homesteaded, and somehow the government owns that. How are we going to have our cake and eat it? How are we going to have open borders and yet keep bad guys out? We're going to privatize every square inch of the country, including the Mississippi River and Lake Huron and the Salt Lake. Every bit of land is going to be privatized. And now, if somebody comes in and doesn't like miniskirts, well, the person who invited them in is going to be responsible for him. And if he does anything, we're going to get them. Namely, that's the way we're going to have our cake and eat it. So it's sort of a complicated view on immigration. I'm for open borders and privatizing everything. Now, one argument against this is that there's such a thing called sub-marginal land in the middle of Alaska that nobody wants because it costs more to homestead it than it's worth. Well, we'll just have to do it anyway. We'll have to have private charity homestead it and then keep people out of there.
Right.
So that would be my view on homesteading. But more important is that whenever there's a debate on immigration, it's done politely. It's done scholarly. Yes, I'm very disappointed, one, personally, and two, because as a scholar, we believe that the way to get to the truth is through scholarship. And scholarship doesn't imply calling libertarians such as me maniacs or whatever Hans is calling.
Right.
So, yes, I'm very disappointed, one, personally, but even more importantly, the Mises Institute is giving up on scholarship. They will not allow a debate. How else can you get to the truth other than a debate? Hans Hoppe has made a magnificent contribution to libertarianism called the argument from argument, or argumentation ethics. But the Mises Institute isn't following that. Hans is he's saying that the only way to get to the truth is through argument. But the Mises Institute is not allowing argument. So
why do you think that is, Walter? Why do you think that is?
I don't know why it is, but I know the name for it, and it's called Israel Derangement Syndrome. That's why it is, because they're deranged.
So then I'm sorry, but like my conclusion when I hear you explain, like you're falling short of saying it's due specifically to anti-Semitism, and you choose instead to call it Israeli derangement syndrome or Israel derangement syndrome. Why the distinction in your mind?
Well, because it's only the Israeli war that leads to this. Because me and David Gordon and Murray Rothbard and Ludwig von Mises were Jews. So how can you see that an organization that I won't say reveres the two of them. I don't think they revere me and David Gordon, but they certainly revere righteously Murray Rothbard and Ludwig von Mises. You can't be an anti-Semite if you revere Jews. And they revere those two Jews and highly respect, at least used to be, me and David Gordon. And there are other, Murray Sabrin is another Jew who is involved, and there are probably a few others that I'm forgetting to mention. Peter Klein is Jewish, and so the idea that the Mises Institute is anti-Semitic is just silly. They're not.
Yeah. Well, maybe not even the Mises Institute specifically. I'm just saying the general sort of perception of why there are so many anarchists that have this Israel derangement syndrome that you're referring to.
Well, I don't think it's that many. I think
or are they just the loudest?
That I think is true. They're the most articulate, the loudest, the biggest megaphones. But my assessment of the U.S. population, despite what's going on in college campuses, is that 70% favor Israel, 30% favor Hamas. And that would be my exact estimate, guesstimate would be a better word, for the libertarian movement. Now, the libertarian movement consists of a lot more than Mises Institute.
Sure.
There's Cato, there's the Reason Foundation, there's the Independent Institute, there's Free State Project. There are 50 different state institutions, such in my state it's called the Pelican Institute. I would say that of all the people calling themselves libertarians, whether anarchists, minarchists, constitutionalists, or classical liberals, 70-75% favor Israel. So it's not that bad. It's just that the people on the campus have attracted a lot of attention. And by the way, there were some Jews in that group too.
Sure. Yeah.
Jewish kids are protesting along with the Palestinian kids against Israel. My favorite group is Queers for Palestine.
That's a that's a walking contradiction right there. It's like,
You have to love Queers for Palestine, because if they went over there, they'd be killed. I mean, that's sort of the ultimate in ludicrousness.
I always like if I was absent context and you mentioned Queers for Palestine, I would have thought it was part of some Saturday Night Live skit or some UCB skit. Like it's just, or a National Lampoon from back in the day. Like Queers for Palestine. You're right. It is ludicrous almost on the face of it, but it does exist, unfortunately. All right, Walter, we've had a great conversation. I want to start wrapping it up. We are now going to get into a section I call silly questions. There's absolutely no right or wrong answers. I just want to throw these questions at you, and you give me what comes to mind, and folks hopefully will get a better sense of who Walter Block is. Okay, the first one. I don't know if people around the country can understand, but we're both New Yorkers. You could probably tell from our accents. And if you're a good New Yorker, you could tell I was raised in the Bronx, and you could tell Walter is probably from Brooklyn, if I had to guess. Yeah, he's nodding his head. Brooklyn. Okay, so being a good Brooklyn boy, which of these three comfort foods would you prefer at any given time? A perfectly smeared bagel with a perfect cup of New York regular, a slice from your favorite pizza shop, or a foot-tall pastrami on rye?
I'm a bagel boy.
There you go.
By the way, I went to high school with Bernie Sanders. And
oh my goodness!
He and I were buddies on the track team together, and actually friends. We overlapped for 4 years in high school and 1 year in college. And
yeah, I think I read you, and I don't want to kick you off, but you actually almost have a solo-like path, or that you started out as a socialist and evolved your way into libertarianism, whereas Sowell probably evolved his way into a constitutionalist, maybe, or a conservative. I don't know how you would describe him. But that seemed to be par for the course. Even who's the guy who ran Time and stuff? Whitaker Chambers, another one, right? It seems that people from that mid-50s period all of a sudden saw the light somehow, and they went from socialism to something not socialism. So that's an interesting transformation there. Walter, would you say that Americans are more afraid of terrorism or liberty?
Wow, that's a good one. That's a nasty question because it's so tough. I mean, you'd think it wouldn't be tough. You'd think that they'd be more afraid of terrorism. I mean, terrorism kills people. I don't know. That's a good one. I guess terrorism. If it's a silly question, I have to pick. Let's say they're more afraid of terrorism, but it's a close call.
Okay. If it inspires an article or a book, please dedicate the book to me then, okay? If you could spend an evening with anyone alive or dead, who would it be? And I'll let you decide the meaning of spend the night with anyone.
My wife.
You have made the diplomatic answer, sir. Do today's anarchists suffer from a PR problem?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, sure. I mean, anarchists are only 1% of all libertarians. And libertarians, if you count the Libertarian Party, are 1% of the electorate. If you count other ways, it might be 20, 25%. I think you mentioned 27%. Mm-hmm. So we're 1% of 25%. Yes, we need better PR.
Okay. And last thing, what is one thing about Walter Block that most people are unaware of, but we would be surprised to find out about you?
I'm very proud of the fact that I am an A handball player because I won a B tournament. And now I've had 2 hips and 2 knees replaced, so I can't play handball anymore, my favorite sport. But I'm doing competitive race walking, and I'm always winning in my age category because I'm the only one in my age category.
Well, that's a way of rigging the contest, Walter. So listen, whatever you're doing, keep doing it. You look great. Your mind is as sharp as ever. You've been a pleasure to talk to. I hope you enjoyed your conversation with me as much as I've enjoyed my conversation with you today. Please give anyone any plugs you have, websites, books, Twitter accounts, whatever you have.
Well, I'm a professor at Loyola University, New Orleans, and I'm always looking for good students. So if you're a high school student or you're a college student that doesn't like your college because there are a whole bunch of commie professors, come on down. The water is fine. We're below sea, so the water's got to be fine. Enroll at Loyola University, New Orleans.
All right. So anyone who wants to learn more about ANCAP, libertarianism in general, economics, the Austrian school, why it's better than the Chicago school, head over to Loyola University. And if you can't head over to Loyola, search out Walter's books, great reads. Search out his online content. He's got plenty of stuff on YouTube, plenty of stuff on the internet. Search him out. It's been great talking to you, Walter. Until next time, when we have yet another interesting guest, this has been Big John. Don't forget to come back next time. Peace, everyone.